So today on the podcast, we dive back down into the life of Disney legend Mary Blair, a woman who is often presented as Walt's favorite artist. In earlier episodes, we followed Mary as she attended art school, then worked at various animation studios in Los Angeles. In the early 1940s, Mary became a key concept artist at the Disney studio, with Walt sending her across the states and to foreign countries to imagine how stories set in those locales might be visually adapted into big screen animation. As we last left off, Mary was finishing key location work in Georgia for The Song of the South and Indiana for So Dear to My Heart as World War II was coming to an end. With the war over, her husband, Lee, a former Disney studio artist, decided to start his own production company in New York, largely to make films paid for by American companies. Mary joined him there, far from her own friends and family who remained in California, though she continued to work for the Disney studio, completing all of her work assignments at home and typically mailing them into Walt. Though Mary doesn't yet know this, she's about to move into one of her best-known iconic periods of production, where she creates concept art that will guide the production of Cinderella, then Alice in Wonderland, and finally Peter Pan. As we finished up on our last episode, Mary learned that after years of trying to start a family, she was finally pregnant, and it is at this point that we pick up her story today. Life in New York in the fall of 1946 was a substantial change for both Lee and Mary. Lee oversaw his own studio called Film Graphics, which was focused on commercial and corporate work. The studio had only a few employees, some of which Lee had worked with in the Navy. But if television expanded as Lee suspected it would, his business was primed to work with advertising companies and networks, both of which were largely centered in New York. But his focus wasn't always on work. Even with his new responsibilities, Lee, when he could, spent time creating watercolors that he might exhibit in galleries. His renewed focus on personal art, at least in part, may have been provoked by a quiet competition he felt with Mary. Now that her watercolors, particularly those she had made on Latin American research trips, had been exhibited in multiple galleries and at a museum. To flush the military tones from his system, Lee enrolled in evening classes at the Art Students League to refine his techniques. This too was a change. In California, Lee had been an art school instructor. Now he was again a student, trying to learn as much as he could. Lee quickly found out that art courses in New York were different than those in California. Though classes in California had often been arranged with an eye toward professional applications such as for animation studios, classes in New York were more focused on personal expression. What was only partially clear in California was now fully clear in New York. For most all artists, gallery exhibits were prestige events that brought in little money, though were central to solidify one's reputation. Money came from day jobs such as at Harman Ising, Disney, or now Film Graphics. Even though Lee would soon be a father, he was drawn to the dream of his youth, to hopefully place himself among artists whose name were known from coast to coast. In this way, Lee found his days divided into three central parts: his home life with Mary, his professional life at Film Graphics, and his continuous dream of being recognized as an artist with a unique vision and accomplishment that would fulfill the promise of his young years, back when, at the age of 20, he had won a gold medal at the Olympics for a watercolor he had created of a rodeo. As for Mary, in addition to preparing their new house for the baby, she continued to work for Walt. Her big project during this period was defining the look and feel of the Cinderella story. Walt's long-awaited return to traditional feature-length animation. Once again, Mary was at the forefront of visual design, particularly for the characters and their costumes. As production supervisor Ben Sharpstein explained, when Walt decided to make Cinderella, he looked for possible ways to style it so that it would not be reminiscent of Snow White. He wanted to plus each picture. He wanted to make every picture better than the last. He was extremely anxious to get something of Mary Blair's natural talents into the character of Cinderella herself. Mary was given every opportunity to contribute in any way that she wished. This resulted in a great number of drawings which she made depicting Cinderella, Prince Charming, and the characters for the film. Though Mary likely made some early sketches for Cinderella before leaving California, she now focused on this subject to the exclusion of most any other project after moving to New York, where she lived far from family and friends, a separation that must have seemed particularly poignant to her as she would soon give birth to a son. In terms of style, Mary's assignment on Cinderella gave her an opportunity to imagine a narrative wholesale. Some of her previous assignments had asked her to translate locations explored on research trips, such as Latin America, Georgia, and Indiana, into a style that would work in animation. But here she peered deep into the story to develop the world as she imagined it. As Mary explained in one letter, Cinderella was a romantic story with no well-known set of illustrations as inspiration. It was a world of her own making, also a world and a character partially developed from recent personal experience. Her images for Cinderella reflected the new physical distance in her own life. In the story, Cinderella's father and mother had both died, leaving her with her abusive stepmother and stepsisters, without a deep support system aside from her animal companions. In recent months, Mary had moved from California, home to her family and friends, and was now in New York, where aside from Lee, she knew hardly anyone. Mary's presentation of Cinderella is of a girl often isolated, who's contemplating how to climb up beyond her current troubles. Mary's version of Cinderella is often looking into mirrors or staring out windows as though imagining life elsewhere. Mary's Cinderella was frequently presented alone at home, which was a significant part of Mary's new life as well. In one painting, Cinderella stands at a window, looking pensively out at the world around her. In another, she runs up the attic stairs alone. In multiple paintings, Cinderella, dressed in a white gown, flees the prince's ball alone with no one following her. Cinderella stands on a bridge alone. She cleans her stepmother's kitchen alone. She tentatively knocks on her stepmother's door alone. In multiple paintings, she wanders the long and wide halls of her stepmother's mansion alone. In one particularly compelling work, Mary presented Cinderella standing in a hallway wearing a brown work dress and white maid's apron. She is leaning into a tall, gilded mirror to take in her reflection, as though trying to fully understand her current situation and what might exist beyond it. The small details of her face, her eyes squinting, her mouth pursed into a round O, presents an attitude of yearning. Cinderella is placing a rose blossom into her hair as though imagining what her life might be like under different circumstances. Yet the overall composition, a slender-waisted young woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and fine facial features, also suggests an image of Mary herself, particularly in how Cinderella's hair was pulled back with a single band at her neck, just as Mary often wore her blonde hair during these same years. Only at the ball, when paired with the prince or briefly with her fairy godmother, was Cinderella shown in something that might be construed as a supportive relationship. Though Mary rarely talked about her own struggles or emotional life during these months, the consistency of presentation here is almost surely a window into her initial months in New York, a sense of separation that was brushed or pasteled into most of the concepts she made for Disney. She painted during her pregnancy, as she prepared a nursery and as Lee worked to expand film graphics and also as he attended art classes at night. On February 2, 1947, after years of trying, she gave birth to a son. Donovan Blair was born on February 2, 1947. He weighed 7 pounds 12 ounces and quickly became the joy of her life. After hearing the good news, Walt sent a telegram to the Disney office in New York directing them to arrange a celebratory bouquet for Mary. Send extremely nice flowers to Mrs. Blair and a suitable flower basket or what have you for Baby Blair. Signed card Lily and Walt. The telegram was listed as being dictated directly by Walt. Though Mary took time off after giving birth, she quickly returned to work, focusing when she could on Cinderella. She spent part of her day brushing out new ideas for Walt, part of her day with her son. We had a real good German nurse that took care of the children when they were born, Lee explained. Her name was Susan Stegmuller. She became very attached to Donovan. Through these months, Mary developed new visual complexities in her work for Disney. Mary played subject against background. If a character's posture suggested despair, the background held elements of hope. For example, in one painting where Cinderella, unable to attend the ball, slumps into a bench, head tilted down and weeping, the colors of the sky, an indigo and violet expanse striped with white-gray clouds, offers a sense of hope. Likewise, when the stepsisters practice their singing voices, their shoulders and heads are firmly arranged with confidence, but behind them are a row of windows with clear framework squares like bars stretching from floor to ceiling, offering the subtle suggestion that they are actually inside of a beautifully decorated prison. Similar visual incongruities continue pointedly through other paintings. One shows a brightly lit kitchen. In the foreground, a flower arranged into a vase. In the background, Cinderella holding a bucket, eyes angled down, lips arranged into a weary smirk. The mansion windows in nearly all of Mary's paintings of the stepmother's mansion offer no view of the outside world, as though the mansion is all that Cinderella can experience. The only window with a view is in Cinderella's attic bedroom, where the panes open to a faraway castle on a hill set against the cotton candy clouds of early morning. In this way, Mary thought deeply as to how visual elements in conflict could expand and complicate the presentation of the story, revealing the range of Cinderella's hopes and limitations in a single image, with the house subtly arranged as a place of confinement. Though her paintings, on the surface, might have looked like straightforward illustrations in a children's book, the colors, shapes, and figures were in dialogue, struggling to define what the image ultimately would present. Each image invited the viewer to participate in this conversation, to take in all of the details in order to discover and contemplate its underlying meaning. But deeply layered emotion wasn't the only strength in her Cinderella paintings and pastel drawings. Her earlier paintings for Disney typically offered one primary point of focus and one underlying emotional tone. For Cinderella, though, Mary considered how her paintings and drawings might better assist the feature's overall development, though other concept artists such as Lee and even Herb Ryman had mostly presented Disney subjects in their own personal style with minimal thought as to how images might fill the large screen. Mary now adapted her personal style so that it better contributed to the development of a large format feature. That is, more so than other concept artists, who typically viewed their personal art as superior to the art they created for Disney. Mary adapted her skills and vision to better fit the Disney projects. She understood that images on the big screen would need multiple points of visual interest. Now, while working at home, she arranged her paintings, most of them typically 10 by 8 inches, to mimic the pictorial needs of an engaging feature. Every 2 or 3 weeks after finishing a new set of images, typically a combination of watercolors, tempera, and pastels, she sent her finished work to Burbank. Despite her distance from the larger Disney organization, members of the story and layout departments were routinely impressed by her work. The damn stuff would just show up, Ken O'Connor explained, and it was awfully nice. Most of the guys in layout thought so. During these same months, while Mary painted her visions of Cinderella, other Disney teams revised the story. Unlike Snow White, which was primarily inspired by the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, Walt and his story team believed that there were nearly 450 distinct versions of Cinderella in the public domain, which gave them endless narrative material to consider. Though the character arc of Cinderella was well established, the story team continued to add and subtract narrative elements to fill out the story. In 1947, the main story treatment included 2 fantasy musical sequences. The first focused on the trials of Cinderella at home. After being promised by her stepmother that she could attend the ball if she finished all of her chores, Cinderella multiplies herself into dozens of identical clones, all of whom follow her directions. The dream sequence would be accompanied by an early version of the Cinderella work song, in which she laments that even though there are now multiple Cinderellas, she still doesn't know how she will finish all of her work in time. This version of the work song sequence was so central to the narrative conceit that Mary developed dozens of paintings and pastel drawings outlining the sequence. It starts with Cinderella falling asleep and then moving into a realm where she multiplies her form. One Cinderella girl becomes 2, which then becomes 3, and so on. Under the direction of the real Cinderella, the clones clean the kitchen, including mountains of dirty dishes so high that the Cinderella clones need ladders to climb to the top. With buckets in hand, they scrub an endless flight of stairs, and then as lightning branches around them, the dream slowly dissolves, with the clones disappearing and the one true Cinderella returning back to her slumbering body. The story team also developed a second fantasy sequence in which, swept up in romance, Cinderella and her prince dance through the clouds and then are finally lifted up into the stars. Again, Mary put together a set of paintings and pastel drawings showing the prince and Cinderella briefly leaving the ball to spend a moment together on the patio. Once the music swells, the couple magically steps into an idealized world where they rise up into the sky, eventually waltzing among clouds until finally they are with the moon and other galaxies. Both of these sequences were eventually cut before they were laid out and animated, likely because neither advanced the plot or intensified the drama between principal characters. But Mary's work underscored not only how deeply she was aligned with the studio, but how carefully she nudged the project forward, even though she was nearly 3,000 miles away from the story team in Burbank. That year, her first trip back to the studio didn't happen until June, a little more than 4 months after she had given birth to Donovan. In part, the trip was to ensure that she understood the current goals for the film. Mary worried that Donovan wouldn't experience the same level of care while she was away, but still, she longed to reconnect with her friends at the Disney studio. She expects to be here at the studio about June 15th, explained Disney manager Jack Lavin, and that she was then trying to work out plans to get someone to take care of the baby and so on. However, she was looking forward to a get-together with Walt. Although short, this trip was the first among many in the months to come. Through the years, she went back and forth to Disney, Lee explained. She typically stayed either with friends or at the Tolucan Motel, which was a short walk to the studio. By this point, most Disney artists were aware of Mary's unique role at the studio. Understanding her privilege to work remotely, some Disney artists expected Mary to have a new sense of entitlement, but this never happened. As Wilfred Jackson, a director on Cinderella, recalled, I found Mary to be a modest person, very quiet and not at all aggressive or pushy about her ideas when we were working together. I did not ever observe her to take the initiative in suggesting to someone else how they should do their work. And yet, when she was encouraged to talk about the ideas behind the design she had made for one of my pictures, I found she had thought about it in depth and had strong feelings about it, and I found her ideas helped me in my own work accordingly. Though most at Disney admired Mary's ability and artistic insight, a few now scrutinized her work, as she had received both opportunities and accommodations not given other artists. Studio nurse and Mary's friend, Hazel George, put these petty jealousies down to a particularly ugly variety of sexism. Some male artists felt she was taking unfair advantage of Walt because she was a woman. But Mark Davis believed these resentments were more deeply rooted in professional envy. Because she was the first one, Davis explained, where I think Walt appreciated the art of somebody. That is, Walt saw her concept work as something far greater than images in service to a film. Even though Mary's drawings and paintings, arranged on small rectangles of illustration board, were produced for a commercial project, they were to him a type of pure art. On that first post-motherhood trip to Burbank, Mary didn't stay long. She spent time in meetings, she reviewed the most recent storyboards for Cinderella, she enjoyed meals with friends, and of course time with Walt. Then she returned home, where she continued to develop the look and visual mood of Cinderella and also take care of her son. In the months that followed, Mary continued to mail finished images back to the studio, where layout artists and animators perused her work to see how it might be adapted or partially adapted for character designs, character costumes, and backgrounds. Most everyone understood that there was a growing complexity to her work. Director Wilfred Jackson was among the first to review her packets when they arrived. There is much more to Mary's designs than just the surface look or unique appearance of them, he explained. Her styling design showed her concept of the characters as well as the locale in which they moved about, and so her styling sketches influenced the look of finished characters too, to the extent that the storymen and animators were influenced to feel what it's like to be the person, such as Cinderella, in the same way Mary felt it. To that extent, she had a part in designing the personalities of the characters in the cartoon as well as the backgrounds. Most lead animators and background painters saw how Mary's contributions elevated the project. She really brought the studio forward, Mark Davis said. Once more, Walt attempted to bring Mary's personal vision into the film, even though her flat designs were difficult to animate. Walt made quite a point of this to the Storymen. Producer Ben Sharpstein explained, Walt took two competent men, one was an animator and one was a layout man, and he teamed them together to set the style of the characters. These men were Ken Anderson and Mark Davis. These two men were caught between Walt with his insistence that they capture what Mary Blair had contributed, and the animators who protested if her styling was not practical for animating. Ultimately, Mary's character designs would give way out of a sense of realistic concern to more rounded figures, easily configured as dimensional and lifelike, and also the type of figures Disney artists knew how to animate. Even though her visual designs weren't absorbed wholesale into the feature, many of her character insights found their way into the project, as did her sense of costuming and at times her background designs, particularly for the stepmother's mansion and the interior rooms at the castle. Mary's next trip to California occurred at the end of the year, an opportunity to see both her parents and sisters still living outside of San Jose and to visit the studio. The trip was not only a much-anticipated excursion, but also a brief escape from the harsh New York winter. By this point, Donovan was 10 months old and able to travel. Likely with Lee, Mary flew from New York to California, first visiting her family for the holidays, then venturing south to the studio. On December 19th, production manager Harry Teitel made a note of her visit in a letter to Disney artist Eric Gurney. Did you know Mary Blair is back at the studio? I don't know for how long this time, but she said she had left her child up north with her mother, so guess the stay will be short. On this trip, Mary worked with story artists and background painters as they prepared to shift the project into production. I also worked and consulted a great deal with the background artist when they were making the production artwork, Mary said. My sketches usually were made as the storyboards were developed. Early in the new year, she returned to Great Neck, where the daily temperatures hovered in the 20s and 30s. Once the holiday leave was over, she believed that she would simply dip down into her previous routine, focused on art she made for the studio and also her life as a mother. But the life of Mary and Lee was about to change in two ways they could not have expected. Though for years Mary had felt a growing closeness with Walt, she likely assumed that their friendship would mostly be limited to Burbank, centered around film production. But she soon found that Walt, when in New York, was going to make a special trip to visit her and Lee, about an hour's drive from the Disney offices in Midtown. In fact, Walt and Lily came to our house in Great Neck, she said, to visit and check on my work when I was working on Cinderella. The trip also included Walt's two daughters, Diane and Sharon, then about 14 and 12 years old. According to a family friend, Walt was planning a trip to New York for some unrelated business, and he called Mary to tell her that he wanted to see where all this wonderful work was coming from. Once in Great Neck, Walt took everyone out to dinner, where he noticed that his daughters were particularly taken by Mary, her elegant appearance and her accomplishments at the studio. Walt's younger daughter, Sharon, said to him, "When I grow up, I want to be an artist like Mary." Hearing this, Walt looked down at his daughter, pushing his eyebrows together with playful scorn. He was aware of how hard Mary over years had pushed herself, how her life with Lee due to work in the war had been fractured at times. That is, Walt understood the great sacrifices Mary had made to become the artist Mary Blair. He took on the playful tone of an overprotective father. "Oh no," he said, "you're going to get married, stay home, and have babies." At this, the Blairs and the Disneys looked at each other, and then the entire table began to laugh. They finished their dinner, then went home to see the work Mary had recently finished. But this visit shifted Walt and Mary's relationship toward a new depth. Now that he was approaching the age of 50, Walt socialized with very few studio artists. He was friendly to nearly all of them, but as opposed to his early years, he now primarily spent time with those who were uniquely gifted. Among the few in Walt's small circle were Ward Kimball, who he once called a genius, and Herb Ryman, who had recently left Disney to work as an art director and set designer for 20th Century Fox. Moving forward, Mary was likely to be in this group, among the select few who had the opportunity to know Walt as a person outside of the studio. The other change concerned Lee. By 1948, his business was growing. Though the first animated TV commercial had been made back in 1941, more American corporations now requested animated spots to promote their products on the small screen. In 1948, among those products presented in animation were Skippy Peanut Butter, Pepsodent Toothpaste, Raid Bug Killer, Ham's Beer, and Carling Black Label Beer. In this, Lee understood that he had been right to start his business in New York. In terms of visual presentation, clean, animated ads were easier to read on early black and white screens that ranged from 7 to 15 inches, as opposed to ads presented with the busyness of live action. As such, Lee's business was now positioned to benefit from the slowly expanding medium of TV. In part to chase these new opportunities, Lee's brother Preston moved from Los Angeles to Westport, Connecticut, about 50 miles from Lee's home. There he set up a small home studio. He didn't work directly for Lee, but at times he worked as an outside contractor for projects taken in by Lee's business. Preston hired an assistant to do his in-betweens, but he did most of his own layouts, animation, and camera work himself. He believed TV assignments were generally beneath his potential. Well, like a racehorse pulling a milk wagon, he said. But the money was good, its future bright, and it allowed him to set up his own studio, as opposed to working under various Hollywood directors. Through these changes, New York was now becoming far more of Lee's city than it was Mary's. Mary's social circle was back in California. But Lee now had his brother as well as Navy friends he worked with at Film Graphics. In this arrangement, Lee was finding success, but also something else, a slowly forming new professional identity. Month by month, he was pushed more into a managerial role, even though he still wanted to paint. At least for now, he accepted this trade-off, particularly as it brought him both money and small bits of business prestige. But those around him could see that this exchange would likely be a problem for him in the not-too-distant future, one that neither Lee nor Mary, both of them basking in the glow of new parenthood, ever saw coming. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Our plan right now is to continue our story about Mary Blair next week as she begins work on Alice in Wonderland and then on Peter Pan. And then after that, we'll explore for a week or two the news and other interesting stories that are swirling around the world of Disney right now. But as always, our plans can change if an important and unexpected news story drops later this week. But at least right now, we're planning to spend another week with Mary Blair in the 1940s and 1950s before branching off into the more current world of Disney news stories. Lastly, As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.